Welcome to Weekly News Highlights, where we wrap up your week with a glimpse back into what went on in the past week. I'm Kim Dami in Seoul. Let's first look back using keywords. This week marked 1 year since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Russia now hinting at boosting its nuclear capabilities, while the West stands behind Ukraine. But with neither side backing down, peace seems a distant prospect. It was an action-packed week here on the Korean Peninsula. On Monday, we woke up to 2 ballistic missiles fired from the north, pushing Seoul and its allies to tighten its defense and security alliance against the regime. The central bank in South Korea decided to keep its interest rate at 3.5%, the first rate freeze in a year. The break from rate hikes was followed by sluggish economic figures in areas including exports. The Bank of Korea has opted for patience with the current interest rate that hopefully tames high inflation. This past Friday marked 1 year since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. 12 months of the crisis have left many civilians, especially in Ukraine, bruised by unwanted destruction. People around the world have also felt the knock-on effect, with inflation and energy price increases seemingly unstoppable. Let's look back at how the past year has unfolded.
I decided to conduct a special military operation. It aims to protect people who have been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kyiv regime for 8 years.
February 24, 2022. With these words, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched a full military offensive to overthrow the Ukrainian government headed by President Volodymyr Zelensky. Western countries and their leaders responded immediately with a wave of economic sanctions and condemnation.
There is absolutely no evidence that Ukraine posed a threat to Russia that would justify Ukraine's invasion. And that is why the United Nations General Assembly also regarded the invasion of Ukraine by Russia as unlawful under international law.
However, Russian forces marched on and took control of regions bordering Russia and along the coastline. The action was met by Ukrainian resistance, aided by Western-supplied weapons. Ukraine retook much of the northeastern Kharkiv region, damaged the Kerch Strait Bridge, a crucial supply route linking Crimea with Russia, and pushed Russian troops away from the city of Kherson. But the Kremlin declared the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions: Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. While little territorial gains were made, the war has had a devastating impact on people's lives. The war claimed the lives of an estimated 40,000 civilians and resulted in 8 million refugees across Europe alone, making it the fastest-growing refugee crisis since the Second World War. Russian attacks have resulted in at least $350 billion worth of property damage. Despite the brutal humanitarian and economic impacts the war has had, it looks as though negotiations to bring an end to the war are unlikely to happen anytime soon.
Both sides they will only be interested in sitting at a negotiating table if they have some advantages from participating in negotiations, or if they believe that they are in a position to make concessions.
In the meantime, Ukraine has stepped up its bid for military aid, including fighter jets, and further economic sanctions on Russia from the international community, not just its Western allies.
So I think a long-term perspective of any foreign government is to provide Ukrainian government with as much assistance, in particular military assistance, to help its defend war effort.
A year into the war, Kyiv remains standing, but whether it can continue to do so is in the hands of more than just Ukraine and Russia. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
Here we have a map of Ukraine from around a year ago. On February 24th of last year, Russian attacks rained on Ukraine from land, air, and sea. And only 9 hours into the war, Russian forces had entered the northern parts of Kyiv. Russia had taken nearly 30% of Ukraine's territory just in February. And 1 year later, Russian forces have largely moved to eastern parts of Ukraine. As you can see, they have largely settled in Moscow Donbas region, an area that Moscow has long made claims for. Ukraine has also come a long way. The green parts of the countries are locations that Ukrainian forces have fought back and taken back from Russian forces. Now, the battle is still ongoing, with speculations that Russia is set to launch a mass spring offensive. For this week's Weekly Focus, where we dissect the hottest topic of the week, it's the somber anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ahead of the occasion, UN General Assembly adopted a symbolic resolution calling for peace in the region. Now, leaders around the world also spoke up and took more actions this week. For more on this developing story, we have our foreign affairs correspondent Choi Min-jung for details. Welcome, Min-jung.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. So let's first go back to Tuesday when Russian President Vladimir Putin said the war was necessary, just like he said a year ago, right?
Right, Dami. Putin delivered a State of the Nation address on Tuesday, and he claimed Russia had no choice but to attack Ukraine. He blamed the West for causing the conflict in Ukraine and added Western countries led by the U.S. are seeking unlimited power. Putin also announced that Moscow will be suspending the New START nuclear reduction treaty with the U.S., which is the last remaining nuclear arms agreement signed with Washington.
They want to deliver us a strategic defeat and claim our nuclear facilities. Regarding this, I have to say that Russia suspends its participation in the New START treaty.
The New START treaty limits the number of intercontinental range nuclear weapons that the U.S. and Russia can have. Now, Putin did stress that Russia is not completely abandoning the treaty, but only suspending it. The comments raised concerns that Moscow might be preparing for a nuclear war. However, Kremlin spokesman dampened fears by telling reporters the suspension of the treaty will not increase the risk of nuclear war. However, analysts are saying that it's concerning that Putin has put out the possibility of resuming nuclear tests, as it would escalate the tensions to a whole new level. Experts are saying that it could become much more than the Cold War, as it would prompt other countries like China, India, and Pakistan to build up their weapons as well.
Right, Russia maintaining its stubborn action on the war. And also on Tuesday, U.S. President Joe Biden also had a lot to say during his semi-secret trip to Europe. Let's talk about that.
Right, Biden gave a speech in Warsaw just a day after his secret visit to Kyiv. He promised that Russia will never defeat Ukraine and also reaffirmed his unwavering support for the country.
Brutality will never grind down the will of the free, and Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never.
Biden had paid a surprise visit to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, on Monday, where he was greeted by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, Biden's visit to a war zone was unprecedented in modern times and a tightly kept secret until the last moment. Only a handful of aides and 2 journalists were allowed to travel with the president, and they were sworn to secrecy and had their mobile phones taken away. It only makes sense to keep the trip undercover, as such an audacious trip by the president is unprecedented in modern times. You know, usually presidential trips would have the backup of heavy U.S. military presence, like during wartime in Iraq and Afghanistan, but that wasn't the case this time around. And secrecy also comes in a bid to protect the Ukrainians just in case Russia launches a large-scale attack.
Right, and it wasn't just a trip and words of warnings. Washington also slapped fresh new sanctions on Moscow, right? And what kind of commitment was there to support Ukraine on the international level then?
Right, the U.S. reportedly imposed new sanctions on some 200 Russian individuals and entities this week. The Wall Street Journal reported that this is part of efforts by Washington and its allies to further isolate the Russian economy. And it also serves to cut Moscow off from access to critical resources that could bolster its military and technology sectors. And countries also vowed to provide additional support for Kyiv during the Munich Security Conference held last week. Estonia's prime minister proposed a plan for the EU to ramp up ammunition purchases for Ukraine's defense, And the Polish Prime Minister said he will speak to the U.S. about increasing Washington's military presence in Poland in response to Russian threats.
Right, lots of military actions coming from Western countries, but it's not just Western countries heavily being involved in the whole Ukraine crisis. It's also China. So what's China's stance at the moment?
Right. Well, the war in Ukraine has really underscored rising tensions between the world's two superpowers, the U.S. and China. While Biden's surprise visit to Kyiv and his speech the day after highlighted the West's commitment to Ukraine, China showcased a favor in the opposite direction to Russia. On Wednesday, China's top foreign policy advisor Wang Yi met Putin in Moscow, and the two reaffirmed their strong relations, saying that they are reaching new milestones. The Wall Street Journal also reported that Putin is likely to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping in the coming months. Now, China has been accused of considering providing lethal weapon support to Moscow, and on top of that, it has reportedly been helping Russia evade Western sanctions aimed to cripple its economy by drastically increasing energy trade and replacing Western suppliers with Beijing's. The U.S. support for Ukraine and China's support for Russia signifies the power struggle between Washington and Beijing. It looks like neither of the countries will side with one another given the rivalry that has built up, especially with the divide recently worsening over an alleged Chinese surveillance balloon. In fact, pundits say China may favor the war being prolonged, believing that it could distract the U.S. from building efforts to prevent China's dominance in Asia.
Right, and no one knew that the war would last this long, but we're already a year into the crisis. The battle is expected to drag on further. What's the outlook for that?
Right, Dami, the war has entered its second year and there seems to be no end in sight. Most experts say it's impossible to predict which side will seize the victory. Some believe that the war is likely to escalate but could end this year as the intensity of the fighting is too high to be maintained for long. A former CIA officer says that sometime soon, Putin will come to realize that his army is no longer capable of taking back what he calls Russian territories, which opens up the possibility of him using nuclear weapons. If this were the case, the U.S. and Ukraine will have to think about how they can deter Russia and respond to a potential mass casualty disaster.
Indeed, spring also may be a tipping point as both sides are reportedly preparing for a mass spring offensive.
Right.
All right. Thanks for your report, Minjang.
Thank you.
The Ukraine crisis also caused around 18% of the Ukrainian population to flee, mainly to Poland and Germany. But those also include Korean Ukrainians, also known as Koryoin, who have made their way back to the land of their forefathers. Our Choi Soo-young has the story.
Over the past 2 decades, Central Asians of Korean descent, known as Koryoin, have been making this neighborhood in Gwangju home. Most of them are descendants of Korean independence activists who moved to the Soviet Union during the Japanese occupation of Korea. With the outbreak of war in Ukraine last year, the village has also become a sanctuary for Ukrainians of Korean descent fleeing the conflict. From March last year, Koryoin village in Gwangju started raising funds for flight tickets to bring them to South Korea. This accelerated when the Justice Ministry simplified the visa issuance process for Koryoin. According to the village, they brought 875 people in total from Ukraine by February 12th this year. In the past year, they have been building a new life in Korea, just like their ancestors did in Eurasia around 100 years ago. Eleanor, who came in April last year, thought it was a miracle to live in the village.
I work as a staff member at the Center for the Village with support from representatives Shin Jo-ya and Lee Chun-young.
As the war in Ukraine shows no sign of ending, it is important that the Koryoin children get an education. Children work toward their dreams by learning Korean at the village's Youth Culture Center.
I want to be a programmer. I like to program something.
However, they need formal documents like an academic transcript from their school in Ukraine to study at school in South Korea.
I hope both the government and the education office understand the current situation, and the school accepts children without documents like this.
Data from Gwangju YMCA legal support show that most of the Koryoin work as day laborers. That's because they only have temporary stay visas instead of refugee or overseas Korean visas. Every Monday, dozens of Koryoin visit the legal support center over working conditions and withheld wages due to the lack of proper employment contracts.
Unpaid wages take the most part of legal consultations and lease agreement issues after that. But I think the biggest problem is unpaid wages.
Living in this country, Koryoin still face many barriers, so they could use more practical help from private companies, civic groups, and government agencies. That would mark a historic new beginning for them at Koryoin village. Choi Soo-hyung, Arirang News, Gwangju.
This week kicked off with 2 short-range ballistic missiles launched by North Korea. That was on top of the intercontinental ballistic missile Hwasong-15 that the North fired over the weekend. According to our defense correspondent Oh Soo-young, the missile provocations were strategically laid out to make a political point. Here's her report that aired on Monday.
North Korea's missile launches over the past 3 days were aimed at making a political point rather than a technological improvement. The regime's firing of 2 short-range ballistic missiles into the EC on Monday was followed by unusually swift state media reports denouncing South Korea and the United States' combined air drills held the day before. The exercise had mobilized key US strategic assets, including B-1B bombers and F-35 stealth fighters, in response to North Korea's firing of an intercontinental ballistic missile on Saturday. Compared to past reports by the North, which included specifics about new technical enhancements to its weapons through testing, the latest reports focused on condemning the South Korea-US alliance and the alliance's scheduled joint drills. While the regime bragged about its tactical nuclear weapon systems and threatened to use the Pacific as a missile firing range, South Korean military officials and experts say the frenzied statements reveal little about the North's actual capabilities.
It is clear that the North Korean government and the armed forces are feeling pressure to demonstrate that the intercontinental ballistic missile of North Korea, ranging from Hwasong-15 to Hwasong-17, are indeed capable of hitting the United States. The country has not mastered the essential technology to have the ICBMs re-enter the atmosphere without any significant damages.
Also, an official at Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff told reporters Monday that it's unlikely Pyongyang is able to mount a nuclear warhead onto the 600mm multiple rocket launcher used Monday morning, as verifying this would require further weapons testing. The official added that the North on Saturday is likely to have chosen to launch the smaller Hwasong-15 ICBM rather than the newest Hwasong-17, as the earlier model is closer to completion, now likely in the final stage of verification. The North's testing of the Hwasong-17 ended in failure last November, as it broke apart and crashed into the sea after second stage separation. Also, by launching the smaller ICBM, it seems the North is saving room for bigger provocations. Seoul and Washington believe the North may escalate its activities over the coming weeks, as it has key state anniversaries and a satellite launch coming up in April. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
In response, the UN Security Council held an emergency meeting to hold Pyongyang accountable for its missile launches, this time requested by Japan. But the 15-member body once again failed to reach a consensus because of China and Russia, who used their veto power. Chinese Deputy Ambassador to the UN, Dai Bing, insisted that piling on sanctions on the North would only lead to a dead end as usual. The U.S. ambassador called on the UN body's lack of action worse than shameful. The last time the Council did take action on the regime was over 5 years ago in December 2017. So nothing fruitful came out of the UNSC meeting. In the hours that followed Monday's missile provocations, Seoul's foreign ministry slapped fresh independent sanctions on Pyongyang. The sanctions were the fourth of their kind during the Yoon administration and also came in the shortest period of time in response to provocations by the North. The list included 4 individuals, including a Russian-born South African national who has helped the North buy oil illegally, as well as 5 institutions involved in developing the North's nuclear and missile programs. Since October last year, a total of 31 individuals and 35 institutions have been blacklisted by Seoul. And there was more than a list of sanctions. South Korea, the US, and Japan simulated the taking down of missiles from Pyongyang in their latest trilateral drill to counter threats from North Korea. Let's turn to our Oh Soo-young for more.
South Korea and the United States practiced coordinating their response to possible nuclear attacks by North Korea for the first time in 6 years. The Pentagon said the two sides conducted the Deterrence Strategy Committee's tabletop exercise, or TTX, on Wednesday. The senior-level discussion-based drill was aimed at sharpening the allies' coordination and joint planning to strategize and execute nuclear deterrence.
Coming to a mutual basis to proceed into a decision of how we're going to react to a North Korean nuclear incident. This is very important. Understanding is the foundation for a good decision. They will not get an answer from these exercises, but they will gain wisdom, which will be critical in a time of very tense situation.
The drill came at a critical time for the Allies, following North Korea's firing of an ICBM last Saturday. They also held naval missile defense drills with Japan in the EC earlier on Wednesday, simulating ballistic missile detection and interception. More joint exercises are coming up, after Seoul and Washington last year agreed to resume the large-scale combined training that they scaled down during the previous Moon administration in hopes of engaging the North. However, Pyongyang has always used the drills as a pretext for further aggression. Experts believe the North will continue its nuclear and missile testing, leveraging the growing geopolitical divide between the West and autocratic governments.
I think that North Korea is encouraged by the collaboration between China and Russia, and also the participation to a certain extent by Iran, providing drone weapons to Russia. I think that the more that, it's the mirror image of the way we feel more secure when we have our allies cooperating with us. They will feel more secure when they think that they've got an alliance of those 4 countries and that their backs will be protected.
South Korea's military intelligence said Wednesday that the North has improved its ICBM capabilities and is believed to be planning a 7th nuclear test to miniaturize warheads. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
South Korea also carried out an air-to-air refueling drill on Tuesday, proving its ability to operate advanced fighter jets. This is the first time that the Air Force has publicly announced that it has carried out a refueling drill. The Air Force mobilized its latest F-35A, the so-called Freedom Knight, stealth fighter, and a KC-330 multi-purpose refueling tanker. The F-35A comes with advanced stealth and electronic warfare capabilities and flies faster than the speed of sound with a maximum speed of Mach 1.6. Its stealth function allows it to go undetected by enemy radar and infiltrate enemy territory and strike key targets. There was also tabletop drills between Seoul and Washington on Wednesday. The two allies practiced coordinating their response to possible nuclear attacks by North Korea for the first time in 6 years. The move is seen as a retaliation for the 4 cruise missiles fired by the North into the East Sea in the early hours of Thursday morning. The North state media reported the 4 cruise missiles hit their target into the East Sea by flying elliptical and figure-of-8 trajectories for over 170 minutes, simulating a distance of 2,000 kilometers. Now, onto the local economy. The rate hike cycle that went on for over a year and a half came to an end on Thursday, with the central bank freezing the key interest rate at 3.5%. The rate freeze came as a clear reflection of poor figures in the country's exports and consumption. Our Kim Hyun-sung with the details.
The Bank of Korea has reined in its longest-running series of rate hikes, for now. The central bank governor announced after Thursday's Monetary Policy Committee meeting that it will keep its base interest rate at 3.5%.
With so many economic uncertainties, we've decided that it would be appropriate right now to keep rates where they are and assess all the current risks.
This plateau in rates comes after 10 hikes in the last 18 months, including 7 consecutive raises before this latest decision. The non-stop rate hikes were aimed at countering inflation, driven up in part by Russia's war on Ukraine, now about to enter its second year. But now there's a new economic risk: China's reopening. With its impact on the South Korean economy yet unclear, the central bank has decided that it's time to tread lightly. There's also the slowing economy. The bank expects economic growth this year to come in at 1.6%, revised down from its original forecast of 1.7%. The central bank also shaved 0.1 of a percentage point off its previous projection for this year's inflation, from 3.6% to 3.5%.
If prices are going where we expect, then we don't see a need to raise rates and tighten further. But as we keep rates steady, we do need to look at the effects of our policies so far.
However, South Korea is not yet out of the woods when it comes to inflation. There are also concerns about the weakening of the Korean won against the U.S. dollar, expected to be aggravated when the Federal Reserve moves forward with more rate hikes, while South Korea stays put.
Thursday's decision does not signal an end to monetary tightening. All but one committee member on Thursday agreed that another raise in 25 basis points in the future is an optimal place to stop. So there may be another rate hike coming up. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
South Korea has gone ahead with a total of 7 rounds of rate hikes since last February. Amid continued rate hikes, household loans in the country last year dropped on year for the first time on record. Last year's lending to households fell slightly to roughly $1.3 trillion. It's a fall around of $6 billion, or 0.4% from a year earlier. The central bank attributed the decline to fewer mortgage loans being taken out amid a lack of transactions in the property market. Also contributing were the rising cost of borrowing and stricter lending rules. That is all we have for you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.